Okay, we continue looking at that skeleton. Now, the skeleton has or comprises of two major parts. We have what we call the appendicular skeleton and what we are calling the axial skeleton. The appendicular skeleton and the axial skeleton, meaning that whole skeleton, we divide it into two components. So when you look at it, there are some parts that make up the appendicular, but there are other parts that make up the axial. Now we begin by looking at the axial skeleton. The axial skeleton. Those images that you're seeing, the one on the left shows the whole skeleton, the whole of your skeleton, how the bones are arranged in your body. We see the part of the skeleton drawn in blue and another part drawn in gray. Now the part that is drawn in gray is the axial skeleton. The one drawn in blue, the one drawn in blue is the axial skeleton, while the one in gray, drawn in gray on that skeleton, is the appendicular skeleton. What is the difference? The axial skeleton is made up of the skull and the vertebral column. The axial skeleton is made up of the skull and the vertebral column. Look at the skeleton on your left. In blue, we see the skull. We also see the vertebral column. We also see the rib cage. So those are the parts that have been magnified and separated on your right. When you look at the images on your right, we are seeing the skull. The skull. We are seeing the vertebral column. The vertebral column from this part up to your waist, with a series of bones joined to each other, which we are calling the vertebrae. That's why we call it the vertebral column, forming what we call the backbones. The backbones. Then we can also see the rib cage, or what we call the thoracic cage, made up of the ribs and the sternum and the ribs. Therefore, when we talk of the axial skeleton, what comes into your mind? Skull and vertebral column. The image on the left, axial skeleton, is indicated in blue. Those parts in blue are the ones making up the axial, while the ones in gray, the limbs and the girdles, make up the appendicular skeleton. Now we shall look at the appendicular skeleton next time. Let's focus on the axial skeleton. So axial, which parts are we drawing our focus to? The skull and the vertebral column plus the rib cage. So those are the parts that make up the axial. So we are indicating that the axial consists of the skull. But what makes up the skull? The skull has that brain, has that bone called the cranium or the brain box. Inside the cranium or inside that skull, that is where we find the brain. Therefore, it protects the brain. Then it also has the bones of the mandibles, the bones of the mandibles, the ones that we see, where we find the teeth or the jaw bones. The jaw bones where we find the teeth. Then it is also made up of the vertebral column. Remember, we've said that the vertebral column is made up of a series of bones called vertebrae that attach to each other, forming a column of vertebrae, hence the term vertebral column. So we can see the vertebral column there. But for the vertebral column, each vertebra, each small bone making up the vertebral column is what we are calling a vertebra. We are going to see that vertebrae are of different types, but they are joined to each other. They are joined or they are attached to each other by cartilage, which we call the forming what we call the intervertebral discs. When you look at that vertebral column, each bone there, a vertebra, is attached onto another vertebra. But where they attach, there is cartilage, and they form what we call the intervertebral disc. The intervertebral discs allow slight movement. So in summary, axial skeleton made up of the skull, vertebral column, and the rib cage. Look at it in blue. That part of the skeleton in blue is what we are calling the axial skeleton. Then here it has been modified. Now, what is the function of the vertebral column? Because we've said that the axial is made of the skull, vertebral column, and the rib cage. What are the functions of the vertebral column? What are the roles of that vertebral column that you're seeing there? 1. The vertebral column protects the spinal cord. This set of bones running from this part through your back to your waist, within it, that is where the spinal cord passes. So when the spinal cord passes within, it is greatly protected by the vertebral column. Just like the skull protects the brain, the vertebral column protects the spinal cord. Then it even provides support to the head, because that's where the head is seated. Provides support to the head. Then there is a joint between the atlas and the skull. The first bone of the vertebral column is called the atlas. We're going to come to those bones. The first one is called the atlas. Now the skull is seated onto the atlas. When you observe that skeleton, that skull is seated on the first vertebra called the atlas. At that point there is a joint which allows slight movement of the head in a vertical plane, like that. This head cannot move and then goes behind totally. It can't go behind totally, but there is some slight movement. Then these vertebrae, we're going to see the parts of the vertebrae, and they are parts which we call the transverse processes. They provide points of attachment for muscles, tendons that straighten the back. Remember, the skeleton is a framework of bones, but it even has muscles attached in order to bring about locomotion. Then we've seen that the vertebral column has a variety of vertebrae, different types of vertebrae. There are vertebrae in the neck, there are vertebrae in the thoracic region, in your thoracic region, which we call the thoracic vertebrae. Now below the thoracic vertebrae, we have vertebrae in the upper abdomen, your upper abdomen, called the lumbar. Then others in the lower abdomen, called the sacral. And we have the caudal that are found in the tail, organisms with a tail. Thou shall see that even early man had a tail, but lost the tail during the course of its life. But there are 5 different vertebrae: cervical in the neck, thoracic in the thoracic region, lumbar upper abdominal, sacral lower abdominal, and caudal that are found within the tail. In the neck, the cervical are 7. Thoracic, in the thoracic region, there are 12. The lumbar, there are only 5. The sacral are 5. And the caudal are 4. But we are going to see when we come to the cervical, which are 7. The first is the atlas. The second is the axis. And the other 5, which we call the ordinary cervical vertebrae. The ordinary cervical vertebrae. Now when we meet again, or when we get to have a discussion again, we shall look at these vertebrae in detail. Remember the cervical, followed by the thoracic, followed by the lumbar, followed by the sacral, and lastly the caudal. We shall move ahead and look at the detailed structure of a vertebra. Until we meet again, keep safe. Bye-bye.